All right, so over the years, over the many decades of folks having built successful and unsuccessful user interfaces, Jacob Nielsen has gathered a couple of principles, right? That some general principles that we can identify and what makes a good user interface, and so that this can guide, our understanding of what it is that we're building. And so let's just go over some of them. Some of you might already have taken. Anybody taking HCI already? Some folks, yeah. So this you might have already covered this in those courses. So let's just go over some of these very generic principles. So one of the principles is that the real world, already has informed your user with how the user works, how the world works, right? Whether it's at work or at home, or at some a lot of the constraints that the world puts on us, right? And so this principle suggests that we should use as much as we can already those constraints that the user is already familiar with, right? So that they don't come in using your application, without knowing anything, right? Already they know a lot, right? And so if we could use some of the we can create a metaphor that allows them to map their understanding of the world onto our application, it'll make make it easier for them to ease into our application. One of the more famous one is the use of a desktop, right? That Xerox was investigating, and then Apple stole, and then became the kind of the standard way that we interact with our desktop applications, right? Of using documents and folders as opposed to having to explain file systems and documents and whatnot, right? And this became very, very popular. Although a lot of times these metaphors start to break down over time. As time progresses, a lot of things that we were familiar with, a decade ago or 2 decades ago, are no longer with us, right? We no longer have rotary phones, right? We no longer have floppy disks or CDs, or, well, maybe we still do. I don't know. So a lot of the metaphors that these user interfaces were built on were based on certain physical objects that we no longer use, right? And some iconography that became very familiar back then, floppy disks, right, or television sets, or that made sense for a particular generation, became irrelevant in later generations. So metaphors such as the iPhone's leather-bound note-taking application, right, became very quickly irrelevant, right? Because perhaps folks other than my wife hadn't seen a leather-bound notebook, right? That or haven't used one of those in ages, right? Everybody had been just typing away at their laptops. Nobody had actually even written anything by hand. So yeah, a lot of these metaphors start breaking down over time, and so we have to be cognizant of that. Oftentimes we can't even think of a valid metaphor. As we progress, everything's starting to look just one big rectangle. So everything's a rectangle. My iPhone's a rectangle, my iPad's a rectangle, my screen's a rectangle. So no more do we have a physical phone that we can pick up and have something that we can put on the on our face, right? Another principle is direct manipulation. Again, this comes back to the example I mentioned earlier of MapQuest and Google Maps, right? Where one of the ways that typically we interact with data is through some indirect way, either dragging a mouse, right, or keyboard or mouse pad. We indirectly manipulate the content as opposed to putting our finger on the screen and moving it around. So Nielsen suggests that whenever possible, allow the user to directly manipulate the data. Other aspects that he points out is that again the physical objects provide some constraints that gives us clues on how they're intended to be used, right? So we might think as a chair, as I can sit on it, right? That's the affordance of a chair. So it has a constraint on it, right? That can only certain things can be done with it, right? Or perhaps you can throw them and break a window or something. But typically, you think of a chair as being able to sit on it, or knobs for turning, or buttons for pushing. So Nielsen suggests that your user interfaces should also provide some of these constraints so that it's obvious what you're being asked to do, right? That there might be that there's not much thinking about it on what is that what you're expected to do or interact with that user interface. Also some mappings of how you lay out certain things that might have, especially if they're in direct manipulation, of how they're related to one another, how certain objects might be related to one another, is because they're mapped in a certain way. For instance, we have the stove on the top where you have the burners laid out in a rectangle, but then you have the knobs laid out in a straight line. And my wife always gets them wrong. She's always turning on the wrong burner because she has to think and try out or look at the image and make some mental calculation of which one maps to which, right? So again, try to eliminate as much as possible any of that mental calculation that we're asking the users to do, and instead give them a direct manipulation or give them a direct mapping of those of what maps to what. Also, another principle is giving the user immediate feedback of whatever actions they do. Right, that if you click or you drag or you touch, right, there's immediate feedback for the user to make a relationship between their action, right, and the response from the system. Any even small delays or missynchronization of what the user does and how the system reacts might create some dissonance between what the user expects, right, and what the reaction of the system is, right. Another principle is a principle of consistency and standards. That humans are pattern matching machines, right? We are always searching for patterns, right? And we find pleasing when we can identify these patterns, right? That if we're listening to a song and we memorize it and then we hear it again and we pattern match, and if they match, we find pleasure in those patterns, right? That if we see a layout of an application and then we see it again, right? We find it pleasant that it's the same thing. I've identified. There's not much recalling, and so as much as we can, we should try and find this consistency, right? The same font all throughout, the same padding all around, all the same margins, the same layout of left-hand side, right-hand side, menus at the top and footers and headers and whatnot, and so users identify these patterns, and as opposed to every screen that you look at is a completely different layout, right? And so folks are even concerned that perhaps they're not even looking at the same application, right? Or let alone that two screens might be related to one another. Right? So certainly patterns. Humans are pattern matching machines. So make use of that. Also, of course, folks, the folks are going to paint themselves into a corner. They're not going to understand something, and we should try and foresee as much as possible what those challenges might be by providing a help and documentation for them. Ideally, its case is context sensitive, so depending on where you have your mouse on, or depending on what screen or what control you have on, we might provide proactively provide some context sensitive help. And ideally, it's not even needed, right? That the application is so self-documenting and so obvious that I don't even need the help, right? That's every software engineer's dream, right? Not to read the documentation, right? It should be obvious that to us. Nevertheless, the folks are going to paint themselves into a corner, and we have to provide ways for them to recover control over the application, that either go back to a previously known state of the application where you might have done something weird and you want to get out, right? And says, oh, just undo whatever I did. I want to go back where I was, where I knew where I was. Some emergency exit that allows folks to just go back to some safe haven here. Others is that the system should provide some means of some clues on what is it doing, especially if it's something that's going to take a long time, right? That that gives us some kind of progress bar, and it's not a fake progress bar, right? That actually maps to some actual task that the system is doing over time, and this is not going to take an infinite amount of time. Others is another principle is that over time, folks are going to become more and more familiar with your application, and a particular way of interaction that used to be fine for novices doesn't work well for folks that are already experienced with that application. So your application should provide some adaptability, some flexibility on allowing to cater to the novice as well as a more adept, where you might provide some shortcut or some other easier way of achieving the same thing, either using the safe wizard that just walks you hand holding you, or some really quick shortcut that does the same exact thing. The other one is the other principle is to try and tax the user as memory as least as possible, right? To not have the user to have to maintain their own mental model, their own context of remembering where they are or what mode they're in, right? So that they might have to calculate their actions based on what they remember from what they are. That you always provide them some context of allowing them to remember real quick where they left off. Right? If they had to step away for a minute or answer a phone call, when they come back, they know where they left off, right? And just continue from there. Provide as much as possible any clues to let them know where they are, either by some icon that might represent something to them, that they can then make a mental note on where they are. Another principle is error prevention, in that we've talked about being able to exit whenever you paint yourself into a problem or you've made a mistake, but try to proactively design your application to prevent the errors from happening in the first place, right? So for instance, if you're asking me for a date, well, don't provide me for an input field where I can type anything I want, because I'll have to deal and parse that content and do some error checking, right? Instead, provide me with a widget where it's impossible to give you anything other than a date, right? Or if there's some ranges that the date has to be between some range, well, then maybe highlight the subset of valid dates, right? Or make all the invalid dates unavailable to me, right? So I cannot make that mistake, right? So design the application in such a way that any of the invalid options are just not available to me. Maybe gray them out or just not even display them, right? The other one is that there are inevitably there are going to be errors, right? That the system is going to encounter some particular set of it's going to encounter a state in the application that is undefined or that was unexpected, and so it's going to have to deal with some of these unexpected issues. And so even here, we should be as helpful as possible, trying to give them context of what happened, and not share any low level error messages that would be completely irrelevant to the user. Having lost some connection to some database or some query, some SQL query that timed out. That's just not helpful to the user. So we might try to be as cognizant of that, of our error messages as possible. Perhaps we could provide some additional knowledge that might be useful for a support engineer, right, with some code or something that could be used to debug or help out in customer support. And finally, aesthetics and a minimalistic design, another principle that some folks were very more successful than others at providing as much information as possible. For instance, Yahoo might, even though the main use case was to find things, right? It somewhat divulged into many other services that were presumably useful to the end user, and just ended up overwhelming the user and watering down the actual main use case of what made Yahoo successful in the first place. Like Google, perhaps, building on that same idea of just focusing on doing one particular use case very well, and saying, I'm just a search engine. You can just ask me anything. I'm your oracle. Right? Eventually, hopefully, with my AI powers, I should be able to answer any question. Right? I'll know you better than you know thyself. Right? And so, I guess on my assignments, I kind of took the Yahoo approach. Oops. What happened here? Where's Yahoo? Excuse me. What happened? Why did I do that? Yeah, so my assignments are more on the right-hand side. I'm going to try maybe move them a little more to the left. Obviously, if you're Google, you can I guess it's a search bar somewhere in there. If you're Google, you can take the luxury of knowing that people know exactly what you can type in there, right? If you're not Google yet, perhaps you might give some clues on what is that you expect folks to type in there, right? If you're Zillow, presumably we would be looking for an address, right? So depending on the context, we would ask you what to type in there. Finally, once these UIs need to be tested, put in front of real folks, perhaps representing the real demographics, real users who are going to be or who are our target audience, and gives us some real feedback on this. And we need to make sure not to take attitudes that we often take as blaming the user, right? Where we use some pejorative ways to refer to the user and try to blame them for not being smart enough to know how the interface works, right? That the project manager might say, where did you find all these stupid users, right? All right.